Good evening, everyone. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm very excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Ron Lieber and Lauren Rivera. Thank you for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the general public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, to name a few. We have over 100 videos of past events archived on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for introductions. We are thrilled to be welcoming back Ron Lieber, the author, as I mentioned, of the newly released The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make. He's also the author of The Opposite of Spoiled, Raising Kids Who Are Grounded, Generous, and Smart About Money, which was an instant New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller when it was released in 2015, which is when we first hosted Ron. He is a three-time winner of the Gerald Loeb Award, business journalism's highest honor. Mr. Lieber, Ron, has been the Your Money columnist for the New York Times since 2008. Before coming to the Times, he wrote the Green Thumb personal finance column for the Wall Street Journal and was part of the startup team at the paper's personal journal section. Interviewing Ron tonight is Lauren Rivera, Ph.D., Professor of Management and Organizations at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. I think I can almost spot it here out of my window. She is an expert on workplace personnel practices with a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. She has written extensively on hiring and promotion practices in elite professional service firms. Her 2015 award-winning book, Pedigree: How Elite Students Get Elite Jobs, investigates hiring decisions for top-tier investment banks, consulting firms, and law firms. She is currently working on a variety of projects examining discrimination in public and private education. Her research has been featured in The Atlantic, The Economist, The Financial Times, Fortune, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR. In recognition for her work, she received the American Sociological Association's William Julius Wilson Early Career Award. It's now my pleasure to bring, for a very sparky conversation, Ron Lieber and Lauren Rivera.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. And thank you to Ron, and congratulations on the launch of your new book. So one thing you might not know about Ron, he's also from Chicago. So Ron thought it might be a fun idea to have a little rapid fire to see if we can prove his true Chicago creds. So Ron, are you okay with my going ahead?
I'm ready.
Okay, we're gonna do this as fast as we can. So what's your favorite neighborhood?
Wrigleyville.
What school did you go to?
Francis W. Parker.
What school are you glad you didn't go to?
The Chicago Latin School.
What suburban school did you think was the coolest?
Evanston Township High School, for sure.
Cubs or Sox?
The less I say about current Cubs management, the better. But I grew up 5 blocks east of Wrigley Field, so you know where my heart is.
Fantastic. Who's your favorite bull?
Dave Corzine, Jawan Oldham is a close second.
What was your favorite bar when you were under 21?
That would have to be the local option in Lincoln Park, now defunct.
And what was your favorite music club when you were under 21?
The Wild Hair and Singing Armadillo Sanctuary on Monday nights for Rude Beat League, which was the house band, and then Biddy Mulligan's on the weekends.
Awesome. What's the best pizza?
Giordano stuffed spinach.
And what is your favorite building?
I mean, it's got to be John Hancock right there behind you.
So thank you so much. So you've true Chicago creds. So I'm so delighted to be interviewing today. I'm so impressed with all of your work, and your book was an absolute pleasure to read. Before I get into questions, is there anything you want to share with the audience?
I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Lonnie and Fan. I want to say thank you to the sponsors. I want to say thank you to all of you Chicagoans who I know are out in force tonight. It is so great to be home. I wish we were actually at home in the Francis Parker Auditorium where we thought we were going to do this. And I also want to say thanks to you, Professor Rivera. Your work, Pedigree, is one of the most epic works of gonzo sociology I have seen, and your sort of penetrating look just by being a fly on the wall, listening as these snobs and elitists made hiring decisions based on where people went to school, was profoundly affecting for me as I tried to help people in my reporting sort out their own strong feelings about what to pay for college and where. So thank you.
Pleasure, and I'm so glad that you enjoyed it and read it. And I loved your book. It was such an intriguing read.
Thank you.
So let's get started with the questions. So as Lonnie mentioned, we'll take audience questions as well, more towards the end, but I had some questions from reading your wonderful work. So I have a couple of questions. There are two halves. The first half really focus on the cost of college, so the actual price, and then we'll go more into the value. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to pay $100,000 per year for certain universities? So the book is called The Price You Pay for College. And one of the reasons I love this title is it really evokes the book's main theme, which is that despite what's listed on a college's website, people are going to pay vastly different amounts to attend the exact same school in the exact same year. And so pricing is both variable between individuals, but even within a given person, it can be somewhat negotiable. And so one of the factors that influences how much a family pays is not only need, as we more and most commonly know, but this thing called merit aid. So tell us more about what merit aid is and who gets it. And for much of, when I first heard of merit aid, I went to college in the Stone Ages. And so I thought this was athletic scholarships, artistic scholarships, you were a valedictorian. Merit aid is something really, really different and way more common than we might think.
Yes. It's so interesting that you seize on the word you. I think about the title as a whole, and I think about the struggle that we had, because for a long time, a couple of years, this book was called What to Pay for College. And the publisher just did not think it had the right spark. And back when I used to work at the Wall Street Journal, we used to look at IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, for headlines to steal. So we would pick the subject, a topic, right, of the piece, the key word, and we would run it through IMDb looking for clever titles. And I spent months trying to figure this out. And then I was listening to Bruce Springsteen, and The Price You Pay is one of his best slow songs. And I was like, oh, of course. There was no one to ask for permission. But anyway, thank you, Bruce Springsteen. So merit aid, right? So when you and I were going through the system, most of the financial aid was given away on the basis of financial need, right? So that's based on what you earn and what you have, and that's the old-fashioned need-based aid system. But starting in the 90s, this is really when it came into force. And the locus of the development was actually in Ohio, where there are a bunch of small liberal arts colleges kind of slugging it out with Ohio State, trying to get people to come. And there was increasingly a disconnect at the less selective schools in Ohio, a disconnect between the ability to pay and the willingness. So Ohio Wesleyan in particular decided they were just going to start throwing $5,000 coupons around at teenagers, right? Thinking that they could attract a better caliber of student if they gave a little money away. And it worked too well, because very quickly, the very next year, the next school down the road, up the interstate, decided that it had to do this too to compete, because Ohio Wesleyan had sort of stolen a bunch of kids away. And so this went on up further on the food chain, and then it sort of spread like wildfire across America. And now we've got all but the maybe 50 most selective colleges and universities in America who are giving away merit aid. And now it's become a sort of tiered thing where at the bottom of the food chain, everybody gets a trophy, right? And it becomes this sort of psychological kind of low-grade war game where different people get different amounts, but everybody gets something, but not everybody knows that everybody gets something. And so everybody's sort of supposed to feel good about it. And it's designed to make you feel things about an institution. And then at the more selective institutions, just to use Ohio as an example, maybe Oberlin is the most selective one there right now. There's still a bunch of people who pay full price, but it's probably a lower number each year. And the people who do pay full price don't realize that it's such a small number. All this stuff is hidden away in places where it's hard to find. So as a consumer, a purchaser of higher education, this becomes extremely murky. And I'm shocked each year at the number of people I run into who actually have no idea that it's going on at all. They're like surprised to get this money thrown at them in March or April.
Fantastic. And you mentioned one of the aspects to my next question here, but why do schools do this? You mentioned the psychological trick where it's similar to why when you go to a mid-tier restaurant, you see a $150 bottle of wine on the menu, you think, who's going to buy that? But it makes you feel a lot better about paying $10 for a glass of wine or paying $50 for a bottle of wine. It's kind of this relative discount thing. But why do schools do this? Why is there such a large price tag and then so much discounting rather than just charging everybody a lower price?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple ways to answer that question. I mean, merit aid is a strategy, and money is used in a competitive marketplace as a weapon, right? As a weapon to buy good students at its sort of, highest and best use, if you want to use that phrase. Or the places where it's been most successful. Let's think about those, right? The University of Southern California, Tulane University, Northeastern University. These were very different places with very different reputations 25 years ago. And they went out on the open market with a above average war chest of resources and just bought smart kids away from more selective institutions, to the point where now each of those schools has admission percentages in the teens. Right? These were all places that were considered safety schools for a lot of the kids at, Francis Parker or Latin or New Trier 25 years ago. And now they're not. They're not a sure thing for anybody. So merit aid is a way to buy students. So for the institutions that are discounting a fair bit, or discounting for more often than not for families who can afford to pay, the question you have to ask is, well, why don't they just lower the price for everybody? And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there's this thing that people in the enrollment management field, which is what you call vice president of admissions now, enrollment management field, they refer to this as the Chivas-Regal effect, which is just sort of a short way of saying is that if something is expensive, people will think it's high quality. There's a legend that supposedly Chivas doubled its price one day and then tripled its sales overnight. The Chivas Regal people actually wouldn't talk to me for the book. I tried to get them to tell me whether the legend was true, and they wouldn't speak of it. But this is how people refer to it in academia. And so the big idea is that if you lower your price, people will think that you're not as good. So, they think about it that way. And then, everybody sort of hopes against hope and against kind of all reason that additional full pay families will come out of the woodwork from somewhere each year and pay the full price and cross-subsidize other students. In recent years, it's been international students, but there are also people whose kids struggle in high school and who just feel lucky that they got in everywhere, and they are happy to write a $75,000 check cashed from the bank of thank God they're going someplace, right? And so if you can get some of those full pay kids and those full pay families, you don't want to reduce the opportunity to zero that'll happen by lowering your list price.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense. So that pattern that you mentioned in terms of variable pricing, and it started happening in the early 90s, there are a lot of things that happened at that point. One of them is we see decreasing state funding for colleges and universities, especially public ones. But another thing that we see is the rise of US News and World Report rankings, which have transformed higher ed. They not only emerged and gained popularity during that time, but they moved from a system where ranking the reputational aspects were more subjective, where they just sent letters to college presidents and said, how good is this university compared to another? They moved to a more concrete system where they made rankings supposedly scientific by looking at easy to measure things like student faculty ratios, SAT scores, et cetera. How has US News shaped college admissions, but also what people pay for college?
Sure. So what happened with US News is they became more data driven, and as they adjusted the formula, schools inevitably tried to game the system. And Northeastern did a tremendous job of doing so. And they weren't, shy about admitting it. If a component, a not small component of your US news calculation has to do with your inputs, right? The SAT score, the ACT score, the grades of incoming students, it is to your advantage to do things to boost those numbers. And how do you get higher scoring applicants with better grades? Well, you go out on the open market and you buy more names, and then you send them a bunch of email, and then you start throwing money at teenagers and their families. And it worked. And if you want to know the story, the full story of how that happened, Boston Magazine did a terrific story several years ago about how Northeastern climbed the rankings. For anybody who's interested in that school, it's just a fascinating historical look at how that place transformed itself. And I have like more than begrudging admiration for what they did, but we should just be clear as consumers what's going on behind the scenes here, because at a certain tier of very good schools, our children are for sale, right? We may not realize it, but people are out there trying to buy them. And so, it's best to know how that process works, if we're going to enter ourselves into it.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So this dovetails to my next question, which is actually, you mentioned the enrollment management profession. There are many eye-opening things about reading your book, but one of them was learning about this role in terms of the people who help game the system and figure out not only who would be good here, but how much a given family is going to pay. So one of the things questions I have about this is that lots of pieces of the financial puzzle that people give to schools, say in the FAFSA, are given freely and with consent. It seems like, from reading your book, a lot of the information that enrollment managers use, such as how quickly a child responds, and I'm calling them children because I think they're under 18 in many cases, but how quickly a prospective applicant reads an email that's sent, or how much time they spend on a given website, can be factored into what merit aid or what type of financial package they're offered. And that information is not given with consent. So I was wondering if you just talk through the ethics of this, both in general, but also what families need to be aware of.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's important just to start, I guess, by pulling the curtain back and explaining what's going on, because the vast majority of families don't understand that there is in fact a wizard behind the curtain, and it's not the VP of enrollment management, and it's not the associate dean of admission, and it's not the assistant director of financial aid. There are a large handful of extremely sophisticated consulting firms, and just about every admissions and financial aid office, every enrollment management operation has a contract with one of them. And they change every several years or whatever, and bring in someone new. But these consulting firms are renting algorithms to the schools, and those algorithms suck in all sorts of information, not just about grades and scores, but about the zip code where you live, which is sort of a code for affluence or lack thereof in many instances. They know a ton about your high school and the kinds of kids that have come to different kinds of schools, who are in the client base and who hasn't, and what sort of offer has been necessary to attract the student, and what offers get rejected. And then all of this other behavioral data around just how interested your kid might be, gets thrown into this black box, and out comes an offer, right? So when your kid gets offered merit aid, more often than not, it's a robot making the offer. A human may approve of it, but a robot is sucking up all this data and then basically trying to make you an offer that is that offers the just enough of a discount so that you will say yes, but not $1 more than is necessary. And that's how it works. So what are the ethics of this? I mean, I guess if you're on the other side of this, the case that you're making is that this is no different than what goes on in any even like medium sophisticated, any for-profit corporation of medium sophistication. So why, given the dollars at stake, again, $300,000 plus at the full retail price, why, given the dollars at stake, would you be surprised that we're doing behavioral research? Would you be surprised that we're using data to make decisions? And I guess I'm not surprised anymore, but when I talk about this to parents, their jaw hits the floor and they're like, what's going on here? Should we be cloaking our web inquiries? I was not able to get any of these consulting firms to admit that they were lowballing merit aid packages to families where the students had spent an inordinate amount of time surfing the websites. But is it possible that it goes on? I wouldn't say that the chances are zero.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And this next question is kind of an amorphous one that was, it made me think while you were just responding, but there's this tension in higher education that has become, I think, increasingly salient over the past 15 to 20 years, which is higher ed is a business, but education is also a social good. And as you described with what you just mentioned with, enrollment management and AI and things like this, and the various financial decisions that are at stake that you talk about throughout your book, do you think that what do you think of that tension, right? In terms of, should universities be run like corporations, maximizing profitability, given that they are also the primary vehicle for opportunity, especially upward mobility in the United States?
I think it's a difficult circle to square. If you're going to accept federal dollars, which all schools do, because if you enroll, students who are Pell Grant eligible, that's federal money, and usually roughly 2/3 of any undergraduate pool, they're going to be borrowing from federal loans, right? So that's federal money. You should be subject to regulations and questions about equity and access. But it is also the case that if you want to be able to devote significant amount of financial aid dollars from your own institutional resources, not from the government, to need-based aid, you do need to conduct yourself like an enterprise in order to not just earn the revenue from full pay families, but fundraise in a sophisticated way and an aggressive way, such that you have the resources that will allow you to throw off the financial aid that will help increase equity, right? So I have sympathy for any college president, say one whose last name is Shapiro, his first name is Morty, right? Trying to sort this out. It can't be easy, and I don't envy anybody in that spot. And so the question we have to ask ourselves, right, for particularly rich institutions like Northwestern, should there be more rules about what happens with those endowment dollars if the institutions are going to continue to have various like tax benefits and tax breaks? And I thought it was good a couple years ago when we were having a very brief national conversation about the appropriateness of hoarding endowment resources. I didn't, I thought the politicians that were going after it were doing it for the wrong reasons, but I wish we could have had a larger and longer conversation about that, because I think that money probably should dribble out to the financial aid budget in a higher volume than a dribble.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So this is my last question about paying for college and kind of the cost of college and the logistics, which is one of the factors that influences how much you will pay for college, has to do with the expected family contribution that you discuss at length in your book. And that is going out the window, so I hear, and so you write. So I was wondering what is happening in its place, and what are, who does it help? Is it better or worse for families? And is it better or worse for the system as a whole?
Sure. So just to take a step back on that, if you are a family that is considering applying for need-based financial aid, which is different than the merit aid we were talking about before. The merit aid has nothing to do with financial need, and a lot of really affluent families get merit aid. The need-based financial aid is still these days based almost entirely on what you earn and what you have. And there's two ways that the calculations get run. Everybody fills out this thing called the FAFSA, the Federal Financial Aid Form. And when you're done filling that out, you get something called an expected family contribution, which helps dictate the amount of federal aid that you are eligible for. Now, some schools look only at that, And then 300 or 400 others look at another thing over here called the CSS profile, which is a different financial aid form that you fill out if you're applying to private colleges. But the EFC is what everybody gets. Now, let's break that down, right? Expected family contribution. I despise the passive voice in that phrase. Expected by whom? Who's this expector? What are these great expectations, right? And the number that falls out of this often blows families' minds. They say, wait, I have an expected family contribution of $57,000. That's for 4 years, right? No, no, it's expected for each and every one of the years, and people are just sort of dumbfounded, right? So what is changing? Well, the name is changing. It is a name that will be less imbued with judgment and values. It's going to be called the Personal Aid Index now. So people like me won't get as exercised about the value judgments here. But the formula is also changing, and it's become clear, in the weeks since the law was passed, that low-income people are going to do a lot better. There are going to be way more people who are eligible for Pell Grants. The Pell Grant amount is going to go up. People at the more affluent end, say you're a family that earns, $200,000 a year, you've got one kid at college, you might get $10,000 a year, under the old formula from Northwestern. It may get a little worse for those families going forward, but it's not quite clear how that's going to shake out. And then, of course, Northwestern can make its own institutional choices about whether it uses another number and allows for different allowances that way. So we're a couple of years away from knowing what's going to happen to the bottom line numbers. But thankfully, that really nasty phrase that made people so mad is going away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So my next series of questions focus on value. So we talked the first part of today's session about price and the things that influence how much you pay. But let's talk about what you get out of it. So the US is obsessed with college like no other countries. Affluent families structure their entire lives and their children's lives, in particular their extracurricular lives, around the prospects of college admissions. And this creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of pain for both families and kids. Is a four-year college degree really necessary? Is it worth that amount of pain?
I mean, worth it for whom, right? I think we don't ask enough questions, particularly at the Francis Barkers and the New Triers and the ETHSs of the world, about what college is for, and also who it's for, because there's sort of a baseline assumption that everyone needs to go and that everyone ought to go. And those are assumptions that we ought to question, right? But for a kid who's reasonably sure, you have to ask yourself, right, what is the actual point of the exercise here? And when I went around asking families about this, I heard one of three things. You go to college for the education, right? To have your mind grown and your mind blown, to have it dismantled by expert practitioner instructors and reassembled into a better whole. Number two, you go to college for the kinship, right? To find mentors, professors who actually care about teaching and care about teaching undergraduates, which are two different things. And then you go to find your friends who will kind of carry you through life. And then you go for the credential, right? Either to grab hold of the middle class and kind of hang on for dear life with your accounting degree or nursing degree or something, or to reach for the more kind of gold-plated degree that will open doors for you. And so if the reason that you are going to college, if none of those reasons are appealing, or if your child cannot articulate, in a way that feels sensible to you, why one of those things, even one, is worth pursuing, then you probably have no business spending tens of thousands of dollars each year to send the kid. And maybe there is something they can do in the world that involves, a different kind of training, or maybe they can take a year or two and really think about what it is that they want out of life, or maybe they can join the U.S. Armed Forces and sort it out that way. So college is not for everyone. It shouldn't be. And there's no rule, even on the north side of Chicago, that you have to participate in this rat race.
Fantastic. So this naturally brings us to the question of, does it matter which college you go to, which is my favorite topic. So is it worth it to take out significant loans to go into debt to attend? I'm going to give you some options. A top tier school, like an Ivy League school, one that might be really high on US News Report rankings, a flagship public school, the non-flagship state university, a for-profit college, and do these answers vary based on the demographics of either the student or the family?
Right. So much is going to depend on what your what your teenager is passionate about, right? Now, if they have not identified any passions, that's fine. That's not a requirement. But I mean, let's say there's a teenager who has fallen hard for sociology, right? Now you can actually go into federal data and figure out which undergraduate institutions are the feeder schools for the largest number of people who end up with PhDs in sociology. And it may not be Harvard. And if you look on a kind of per capita basis, which is reasonably easy to figure out, and I explain to people how to do that in the book, Where to Go Looking, you'll find that there are small liberal arts colleges that are not the hardest ones to get into and not the most expensive, and that offer merit aid where you can go and train to be an ace sociologist, right? Now, where I find that most people in communities of above average means, seize here, right, is that they sort of seize on the Ivy League in particular, and other similar selective schools, because they just believe that will open doors. And my question about that is, well, what doors exactly do you wish to open? Because the crux of your research and your work in pedigree, I mean, the moral of that story, to me, the moral of your book is that if your kid at age 16 or 17 is like dead set on getting an analyst job at McKinsey or going to work at Goldman Sachs, the difference between Princeton and Cornell might actually be a difference that makes a difference, because they are such elitists at these firms that they may look down on you if you go to Cornell. It's like never occurred to these people that maybe you went to Cornell because the financial aid package was like $15,000 a year better. Maybe that's why you did it. And so there are concerns there depending on the interest of your kid. And then, if you're a person of color, if you're a person from a low income background, if you're in your first generation to go to college, I know you have some issues, Professor, with some of the research that's been done on trajectories and how income changes. But I do think the research is pretty clear that if you go to a super elite institution as a low income first gen person of color, you can attach rocket boosters to your sort of social class and economic earning advancement. And that is data that we should not ignore.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I have a question that is probably my favorite question, but probably all the parents in the audience's least favorite question, which is about the purpose of college. So classroom learning in college in the United States is only a very, very small part of what we expect from college and what the experience of a four-year college is. And unlike in certain European countries, which you talk about in your book, where college is significantly cheaper if you are a citizen in those countries, there it's primarily about academics. Here, it's a total residential experience. As you talk about in the book, it's a transition from childhood to adulthood. It's where people forge lasting social connections, where they find potential romantic partners or spouses. It's where they see it as a place to explore different career options, different identities, make mistakes, experiment with independence, and kind of this process of becoming an adult. Now, COVID really brought to light the kind of more marginal role of academics in college, because what COVID did is it stripped down at many places college to classes, and parents and students were mad. Even when room and board fees were refunded entirely, which in many places they were not, but people wanted that social experience. And COVID also revealed just how dependent universities are on room and board, as well as student fees, to exist. And so in typical times, a US college really does have this all-encompassing needs. When I was a residential advisor at Harvard, we talked about constantly how we're in loco parentis, like we are responsible for filling kids' psychological needs, their academic needs, their emotional needs, their medical needs with university medical centers, their leisure needs, and so forth. And as you point out in your book, doing all of this is expensive. It's way more expensive than just classes. And some of the research suggests that our current state of how we do college isn't actually the most effective for all people in terms of learning. So this is a very, very long-winded academic way of asking a question, but I promise there is a question at the end of this, which is, can you see an alternative to our current residential system that would be more effective at teaching students, but also less expensive for families? Because at $100,000 a year, this is expensive for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is yes. It already exists, and it exists for all sorts of people who we sometimes forget to talk about when we're having this conversation about college. Because usually when we talk about college in communities of above average means, we're talking about that traditional residential undergraduate experience that got blown to smithereens for the last year. Right. But out there, in the world, there are all sorts of people who are going back to school for whatever reason. They never finished or they never started. And they're going to Southern New Hampshire University, and they're going to Arizona State Online. They're going to nonprofit online programs that are sort of custom designed to be interactive and sort of pay as you go and modularized. And a lot of them are really good, and they're pretty cheap. And so that works, but those people are shopping for something different. And what you and I are talking about here tonight is the traditional residential undergraduate and experience. And for better or for worse, that has become a rite of passage in this country, such that we do not have much of an imagination, or as of yet, much appetite for something different. I mean, the thing that's so interesting about what's happened here is that in the last generation, there's been all of this innovation around pricing and discounting, albeit the kind of innovation that's sort of confusing to consumers. The user experience, right, to this innovation has been lousy, right? But there has been basically no innovation in the way that the education is delivered or around the experience of the undergraduates. And I don't think we want that, turns out, right? I think we learned that in March and April when everybody went home, and then they freaked out and demanded refunds and started suing right and left. And then what happened in September, right? All these institutions that were willing to open, people came flocking back against all reason and were willing to pay in full for extremely compromised experiences. So what does that tell us? People crave the stuff other than the learning, as you said in the question, right? They crave the kinship, they crave the experience. And when they weren't getting it in the spring, they were like just desperate to come back, come what may, in the fall. So I don't think that suggests that this whole thing is about to go off the rails.
Yeah. And one of the things that's so interesting about that, at least at Kellogg, and granted, I don't teach undergraduates, I teach graduate students. One of the things that we observed was that even among the students who came back and were excited to be on campus, once within a week, most of them didn't want to actually be in the physical classroom. They wanted to be with their peers, and those who had signed up for hybrid classes actually started to elect to take them from their apartments in their dorm rooms, because that's not really what they were there for. That didn't make a difference to them. It was really the in-person that mattered in terms of being with other classmates. So speaking of COVID, I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have questions about COVID on their mind and how the pandemic is going to affect both admissions, but also college financing in the short term.
Sure. So there's a couple components to that question. There's the admissions component, and it's already clear what's happening at the more elite institutions, right? The more selective institutions are getting more applications. We saw it with the example that's been floating around in enrollment management circles is what happened at Duke. So Duke University has come out and said that they're going to accept less than 5% of applicants in the regular decision pool this year. Duke's always been it's been a popular place for a long time and a selective school, but this is just, this is crazy, right? So why did this happen? Well, the working theory is that because a lot of these schools went test optional, a whole bunch of people decided to take a flyer who might not have gotten good tests and might not have bothered in the first place. And maybe that's the case, and maybe it's not. We'll see. But then somebody texted me a headline today suggesting that in the SUNY system, applications are down 20%. That seems, I mean, that's sort of stunning to me, right? And we know from the enrollment figures that we've already seen from this fall that kind of like the less selective the institution, the more that enrollment has fallen. So, the people with less are going less and applying less, I think is sort of what the trend looks like. And so, if you're aiming for the 100 most selective institutions in the country, it's going to be a tough year, but there may also be a lot of waitlist activity. So we'll see. As far as the money goes, I mean, it's just the Wild West, I think, the same way that it was last spring. The algorithms did not exist and were not programmed for this sort of environment. And one of the things that's not going to be clear yet in the spring, the same way it was not clear last spring, is it's not going to be clear like what kind of experience you're actually signing up for the, you're depositing for 5 months later, and 5 months in COVID time, who knows, right? But I don't think these college kids are going to have needles in their arms by Labor Day. And so if they don't, right, what does that mean? Another compromised semester, another compromised year? I wonder if at a certain point, people are just going to get wise to the fact that, it may not make a ton of sense to pay in full for this experience right now. I don't think I would if I was a parent.
Fantastic. So my last series of questions from me it's a multi-pronged question. So in terms of college financing and what we can do, can you give just a kind of your top line advice for 3 different situations? One is a family that has a young child or young children. Second, someone who has a middle school age child. The last is a high schooler.
Sure. Okay, so you've got little ones. Start early. Save as much as you reasonably can. Don't beat yourself up if you're not able to put away, $1,000 a month on a trajectory to, pay in full for Northwestern. Don't worry about that. Save as much as you reasonably can, and have a conversation with your spouse, if you have one, that goes something like this. And maybe this is a conversation you've never had before, right? Let's talk about what it is that we would do differently financially if we could do our own undergraduate experience over again. And then talk that out, and then imagine, okay, what would it be like to apply those improvements that we wish we could if we were able to go back, to apply those potential improvements to our own child or children? And what does that mean from a financial planning perspective? How much money would we need to achieve the goal that we think that we would like to set? You'll probably learn something about one another by having that conversation. You may not agree, right? But that sort of informs the plan. So then you get to middle school, right? At that point, you want to check in with your spouse or your ex, if the spouse is your ex at this point, or with yourself if you were raising a child alone, and say, okay, what kind of financial trajectory do I seem to be on here, right? How much have we saved, if anything? How much has it grown? What's going on with college tuition inflation? And do we feel the same way that we felt 10 years ago about what our goals should be, and the corrections we want to make for our own kids to the experience that we may have had ourselves? And then in high school, you've got to start having a conversation with the kid where you talk more openly about money maybe than you have before, because I do think that teenagers are entitled to know what their parents' intentions are. Do you have the money saved, or could you earn the money to pay in full, for a Northwestern or an Emory or a Southern Methodist University? Do you intend to only pay as much as it would cost to send them downstate to the U of I? Do you have some different formula in mind? And is there a difference between your ability to pay and your willingness to pay? Because if you appear to be flush and your kid knows that, but you're going to apply some sort of cap to this expenditure, you need to be ready to say why. I think teenagers are entitled to an explanation about this stuff, and you should probably be ready for some pushback. And again, if there's a spouse or an ex in the picture, you want to make sure that you're on the same page and ready for that conversation. In part because if a teenager is going to have to work super hard to get a large merit aid package in order to go to a more selective private institution, they should know, what goals they need to set for themselves.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to take 2 questions from the pre-questions to the event. The first is, do you have any tips for children with disabilities or learning differences? And the second one is, are need blind admissions actually need blind?
Okay, so to the first question, this is not something that I'm a specialist in, but here's something to watch if you have a child with learning differences. There's a pretty good chance that both high school students right now and first and second year students as undergrads are not learning as much as they should be and making the kinds of progress that they might be if everybody was in class. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, what is that going to mean, not for next month, but for next year? And is there a possibility that teenagers like that will get to college and would have been successful under normal circumstances, but may not have the tools that they need to succeed once they get there, given what's happened for the last year. And so that's just something to watch out for. So the question is need blind really need blind? Well, so the question you have to ask yourself about need blind institutions is, I don't think anybody's lying about meaningful need, but you need to make sure that if they are need blind, are they meeting the full demonstrated need of the family once they get in? Because not every school does, right? And so you definitely owe yourself a trip to the school's net price calculator. Every school has to have one by law, and they're generally pretty accurate as long as you put the correct information into them. And you can call the school and ask questions if you're having trouble with it. And if the result seems weird to you, it is totally okay to call a financial aid officer and said, hey, will you check this out or just walk me through it? Because we're thinking about applying early decision and we want to make sure that we understand what's going on here. Also, something else that college counselors get really mad when I say this, but let's just all remember that early decision is not binding. It is not binding if you are in a financial bind and the result that you get from the financial aid office after your kid is accepted is not going to be affordable. You do have an out. I'm not so sure that people should be, sort of aggressive about that, but early decision is not legally binding. Nobody's going to sue you if you back out. And for years and years and years, I've been looking for examples of schools that were supposedly punished in the next year if somebody had backed out the year before. I've never been able to find such a thing. And if somebody can document that for me on the record, I would love to write about it. But for now, I don't actually believe that early decision is as binding as it should be, or as people think it is. And if more people walked away, we might just blow up the system, which might not be a bad thing because early decision is kind of classist, right? For people who have some financial uncertainty, it means they can't or may not want to avail themselves of the privilege of better admission odds that come from applying early.
Fantastic, thank you.
Ron, Lauren, thank you so much for a great conversation. The Q&A is blowing up. So I'm going to rush in. Ron, we're going to go to the extent you can have a lightning round.
All right.
Just run through this and we'll go with the popular kids first in terms of upvotes. So Vicky asked, do you think the cost of colleges will decrease in coming years, either via ticket price or amount of merit aid given because of the impact of COVID?
No. I think people want to go back, and the percentage of the population that can actually pay in full or close to it is going to go up, not down, because of income inequality.
Thank you. Dorothy asked, do kids who apply and accept a binding early action college offer still get considered for scholarship money?
Oh,
We'll
this is a good one, right?
since they
So
don't need to be bought since they've already accepted.
exactly, right? So this is an extremely complicated question and nuanced one. So if you're applying early and it's binding and it's a school that offers merit aid and you don't have any demonstrated need, but you would very much like to get $20,000 off because your family earns $220,000 and that would be a significant difference maker. Putting yourself in a binding situation is super tricky, right? Because put yourself in the shoes of the admissions officer, right? You're not going to use your discounting budget for people who are raising their hand and saying, I'm going to come here no matter what. And so what would be nice is if the schools would actually be transparent in predicting what kind of merit aid might be on offer were you to get in. And so my hat's off to Whitman College in the state of Washington and the College of Worcester. I wrote a whole chapter about Worcester in the book that's about a lot of things, but it's also a part about their transparency where they will do, in effect, a pre-read of your application and give you a sense of how much merit aid you'll probably be eligible for if you get in early. I wish every school would do that. Ask other schools for that. If you're in that situation, tell them Ron Lieber sent you and tell them that they should behave themselves more like Whitman and Worcester.
Very good. Nicole asks, Ron, out of curiosity, can you throw out some college names that you think are great deals for overall education and value for an undergraduate?
I probably should not be in the public endorsement business,
Okay.
but I did write a whole chapter about the College of Worcester in the book. And I would just say, I mean, look, these are my Midwestern roots showing here, right? To my mind, and this may be more true for East Coast kids than Midwestern kids, the small liberal arts colleges of the greater Midwest offer incredible value to my mind.
Okay. And I think, check me if I'm wrong. I think you might have answered kind of this question, but let me know. Hold on one second. Why can't schools give scholarships or merit scholarships right away? How can a student commit if we don't know what it will end up costing? Did you kind of answer that?
Sure. Well, the way that they answer that question, I actually haven't answered the question.
Okay.
What they say, like, I remember being in the office of the VP of Enrollment Management at Case Western. And I think literally, I practically lost my temper, sort of raised my voice. I said, you're a technology driven institution and this person happened to be a very numbers driven guy. I said, why can't your net price calculator predict merit aid? Because some of them will, right? But his wouldn't. And he said, an algorithm is really good at predicting what happened last year, right? And he had a point. If Kenyon does something funky, chasing all of the computer science applicants or all the people who are interested in biology or chemistry, he's got to respond in the marketplace. And if he's got some net price calculator, predicting what kind of discount he might offer, and then he's got to change his mind, people are going to be mad. So I get that. I think part of what's going on that they don't want to say is that they don't want to tip their hat competitively, right? These are schools that compete with one another. And so if the offers are transparent and out there on a list, well, then somebody can undercut you pretty easily.
I want to remind everybody we're doing an after hours that's going to start at 8 o'clock in about 6 minutes, give or take. Well, actually closer to 8:05. The way you get into after hours is you buy a copy of this man's great book that is out today. The link is in chat. There will be lots more Q&A, more casual conversation. I'm the moderator of the room and Ron is going to join us. Maybe Lauren's coming if she can. So just a quick reminder, if you have more questions, that's another way to get another at least half hour, 45 minutes with Ron. Okay, next question. I just had it here and then things went around. Okay, so Amy asks, we are now seeing enormous uptick in applications to the most competitive schools. Places are reporting 2 and 3 times the number of applicants over prior years. Do you think that will reduce the type of merit aid we will see being given?
Well, at those institutions, no, because either they offer it or they don't, right? And their budgets are generally pretty much set. To the extent that there are more applicants generally overall in the pool this year, that's going to be a one-time blip or maybe a two-time blip, depending on the number of people who take gap years next year too. And so I don't know that that's really going to change things permanently.
Okay, Rusty has a nutshell. Should applicants then therefore spend lots of time on college websites to get accepted and get good merit aid?
So this gets into a hazy area where a number of colleges do take into account something called demonstrated interest in the admissions side, right?
Right.
And one of the and this is something that has some classism embedded in it too, because one of the best ways that you demonstrate interest is to show up and visit. But if you don't have a lot of money, you can't go visit, right? And so the schools struggle with this some. You can also demonstrate interest, indeed, by opening your mail and going to a webinar and things like that. So the concern is, and there are schools that have been caught doing this in the past, although it's pretty rare, right? The concern is that if you appear too eager, the algorithm might notice that and undercut your merit aid. I tried to prove that was going on. I had a hunch that it was, and I was not able to document that it has. If somebody has proof of that and they want to send it to me anonymously or not, I'm easy to find. So I don't know if you should restrict web usage, but you should certainly make sure that you understand how an institution defines demonstrated interest in an admissions capacity.
Tom asks, how much do all these consulting firms, marketing shenanigans, large enrollment management staffs, et cetera, add to the overall cost of education?
The estimate that I generated is like roughly $1 billion a year gets spent on all of this, right? The mailing list and the staffing and the consulting firms and and all of the rest of it. One of the big firms was bought out by a private equity firm, for a number that had a B in it, like billion. And so it's a not insignificant amount of money. But if you're a corporation and you're not spending on sales and marketing, you're probably dead in the water. And these institutions are competitive with one another. And one of the ways, they compete is through the deployment of technology and software to try and undercut one another on price. And so, we're lucky to have a lot of choices for higher education in the United States. But the downside of a thriving market is, a lot of money gets spent while they beat each other up in front of our very eyes.
Mary asks, what about the community college to university path, especially for the average student?
I think it's a spectacular way to make money. In the book, I have a whole chapter kind of laying out the blueprint for this. The problem with this, in many instances, is it's seen like a sort of easy money, right? It's like a great way to save money, and it's a sure thing. And it is far from a sure thing if you don't know what you're doing. You need to go into the community college with a destination in mind. You need an advisor at the community college, an advisor at the intended destination, and you need not to waste a single second if you expect it to all happen in 4 years, thus generating the savings that you thought it was going to. Because it's really easy to not end up in the right classes, and then things don't transfer, and then it takes you 5.5 years, and half the savings have evaporated.
Got it. Melissa asked, did Northeastern climb the rankings only with respect to U.S. News and Report, or did the quality of the school actually increase?
Define quality, right? Because some people believe that, a school's reputation as defined by U.S. News makes a difference in the marketability of their end product, right? How likely is someone to hire a Northeastern graduate or accept them into law school or something, right? So much depends on how you define quality. Now, Northeastern's sort of an interesting case because they had a couple other things going for them, right? Urban schools have benefited from the growth and the thriving nature of cities the last decade or two. And the thing that Northeastern had going for it too is that it has this co-op program, right? So you get all this work experience as an undergraduate, and you come out more career ready on average than I think most undergraduates would elsewhere. So in some ways, they're a unique case, and they benefited from both those things too. But reputation enhancement, the fact that they're accepting such a low percentage of their students, these are things that are known now out in the world, and it accrues to Northeastern's brand, no doubt. I mean, I think they believe that the money that they threw at Meridate in particular was money well spent.
Okay, and on that note, we are at 8:01. Lauren, I want to thank you so much for serving as Ron's, what did you call her? Griller. Ron's griller. Thank you so much. We do appreciate it. And we hope to host you to talk about your book soon as well. That would be great. Ron, get your join link ready for after hours. Everyone, thank you for joining